The challenges we face today are truly overwhelming. Yet, we are not the first people to have to overcome our fears. Our sermon series, Profiles in Courage, will look at scriptural heroes to inspire, embolden, and encourage us to keep the faith in the face of fear.
Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people,
"Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land."
Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that were imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah,
"When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live."
But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them,
"Why have you done this, and allowed the boys to live?"
The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them." So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people,
"Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him.
"This must be one of the Hebrew children,"
she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter,
"Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?"
Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her,
"Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages."
So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because, she said,
"I drew him out of the water."
In our story today, Pharaoh possesses many things. Namely, Pharaoh possesses vast amounts of power. Power appears in soldiers and swords and chariots. It appears in Pharaoh's utter control of his subjects, of the economy. It appears in wealth and women at his disposal. Pharaoh indeed possesses many things, but there is one thing in Pharaoh's life that rather than Pharaoh possessing it in fact possesses him, and that's Pharaoh's fear. Our story today is a story about the unlikely heroes that without whom the story of Exodus could not be told. These unlikely heroes, without them, there would be no Moses. There would be no liberation story for Israel being liberated from slavery. Now, these two unlikely heroes in our story today, their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They were Egyptian midwives under the control of Pharaoh. And with all that Pharaoh possessed, with all of his might and power, there was something that Shiphrah and Puah possessed that Pharaoh didn't have. You see, Shiphrah and Puah, they possessed a fear that was stronger than Pharaoh's fear. While Pharaoh was busy fearing how he might lose his position at the top of the pyramid and how he was willing to do whatever it would take to maintain that position, Shiphrah and Puah, on the other hand, they feared God. And it turns out that that makes all the difference in the world. For Pharaoh, his fear, it rises up in the face of the unknown, the stranger, the unknown other. At the top of our text today, we learned that Pharaoh didn't know Joseph or Joseph's people, the Hebrew people. He didn't know them. The former Pharaoh did, but he didn't know Joseph or the Hebrew people. And we all know what happens when we don't know someone, right? When we don't know someone or a group of people, it becomes much easier to dislike them, right? To paint them with a broad brush, to turn them into some sort of boogeyman. The unknown has a way of fostering fear, and fear has a way of fostering hatred, and hatred has a way of fostering violence. Sadly, history testifies to this truth, whether it's slaves in early America or Jews in Nazi Germany or black South Africans under apartheid or black Americans in the Jim Crow era. In all of these cases and more, it seems that the unknown fosters fear, and fear fosters hatred, and hatred has a way of fostering violence. In our story today, in Exodus, Pharaoh, he didn't know the Hebrew people, and so he feared them. He feared that there were too many of them. He feared that the men might rise up and join enemy armies, and he feared that they might take away his power, take him out of that place at the top of the pyramid. So Pharaoh's fear, it eventually, unsurprisingly, turns into violence. And he throws all of his might, all of his power at this so-called problem. But Pharaoh, in this story, what we find is that his power is actually weakness. You see, Pharaoh fears the Hebrew men particularly. He's a strong man leader. He has no way of understanding power in any other way than to fear the strong men who might rise up against him. When in reality, who he should really be fearing are the women in the story, the Egyptian women and the Hebrew women in the story. It's the women who upend his evil plans at every step of the way. It's the women whose conviction and courage cannot be suppressed. For example, in each stage of Pharaoh's evil attacks upon the Hebrew people, it's the women. It starts with the resilient Hebrew mothers, right, who thwart Pharaoh's first plan. Pharaoh inflicts harsh labor upon the Hebrew people. He enslaves them, does all that he can to make their lives bitter and not worth living. But what do we hear in verse 12? But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Now it takes resilient, courageous mothers, Hebrew mothers, to continue to raise strong Hebrew children under such oppressive conditions. So they thwart his first plan. After them, it becomes the defiant Egyptian midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who thwart his second plan. Pharaoh orders all the Egyptian midwives to kill every Hebrew boy upon birth. But we hear again in verse 17, the midwives feared God. So they didn't do what the Pharaoh told them to do. They didn't follow orders. Instead, they let the boys live. Then in the last stage of the story, it's the subversive daughters who go against Pharaoh's plan. It's Pharaoh's own daughter, the princess, and Moses' sister, a Hebrew slave, who subvert his plan. Pharaoh, he enlists all of Egypt. He tells all citizens that if you see a Hebrew boy, you are commanded to throw them into the Nile River, a vicious command. But we hear again, when Pharaoh's daughter, when his own daughter found this basket with the baby boy in it, and it's little Moses, and he's crying, she has pity on him. She has compassion upon this Hebrew child. You see, in this story, true power, it seems, does not rest at the top of the pyramid. Instead, it rests at the bottom of the pyramid in this story. True power is in the conviction and in the courage of the women in the story. What it comes down to is this fact that the women in this story, they possess a fear that is stronger than Pharaoh's fear. They fear God, and that makes all the difference in the world. Now, going back to these Egyptian midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, Pharaoh seems to think that he can trust these midwives, that he can trust the Egyptian midwives Shiphrah and Puah to hold within their hearts the same fear and the same hatred against the Hebrew people that resided in his heart, right? But what we see in the story is that he's sorely mistaken. While Pharaoh may not know the Hebrew people, Shiphrah and Puah, they do know the Hebrew people. As Egyptian midwives who served the Hebrew women, they maybe had the most intimate of relationships with them, right? They knew these Hebrew women. They had seen them through the pain and the joy of childbirth. Shiphrah and Puah, they fear God, and because they fear God, Shiphrah and Puah, they're able to see in the Hebrew women and children their own reflections, right? They refuse to let fear of the unknown, fear of the stranger, of the other, convince them that somehow these Hebrew women are less human than themselves. Their fear of God leads them to love the Hebrew women rather than fear them. But it's true that they still face the unknown, don't they? Right? What would Pharaoh do if they didn't obey his orders? What would Pharaoh do to their own lives? What would happen to them if they disobeyed? What would Pharaoh do to the Hebrew people? Even worse, if they disobeyed his orders. The unknown, it looms large in front of them. There is much to fear, but their fear of God gives them courage to stand firm in the face of the unknown. It's amazing. Pharaoh confronts Shiphrah and Puah after he realizes what they're doing. He says, "Why have you allowed the Hebrew boys to live?" And then Shiphrah and Puah, they're strengthened by their fear of God, and they stand firm in their convictions. And they do something amazing. They tell what we might call a holy lie. This is what they say to the Pharaoh. They say, "The Hebrew women, we're sorry, they're just too darn vigorous in childbirth." And so they give birth before the midwife can reach them, right? It's an amazing thing that they do. Shiphrah and Puah, they brilliantly use Pharaoh's racism and bigotry against him. See, Pharaoh, he already believes that the Hebrew people are somehow less human than the Egyptians. He already thinks them to be brutes and animals. And so Shiphrah and Puah simply tell a lie that makes sense within Pharaoh's understanding of them, right? It's pretty convincing to him. This is an amazing, brilliant tactic, and it is so courageous of these Egyptian midwives. Shiphrah and Puah, they didn't know what might happen, right, when they stayed true to their convictions. The unknown, it was scary. They didn't know what might unfold. There was much to fear. But again, Shiphrah and Puah, they took a step of faith into the unknown. They trusted God to be faithful to their faithfulness, right? Their fear of God was stronger than Pharaoh's fear. It gave them courage to stand firm in the face of whatever might come, right? To stand firm in what they knew to be right. Now, I wonder today, in our own moment of fear and unknowing what God might be calling the church to do and to be. I wonder today, how might God be calling us, be calling the church to embody that same courage that Shiphrah and Puah demonstrate, to stand firm in the face of the unknown, to submit our fears to our ultimate fear, to our fear of God, whether that be our fears of the other, of the stranger, those who we don't know, or if it's just simply our fears of the unknown future, uncertainty of what lies ahead. You know, earlier this year, before the pandemic made its bitter arrival in our lives, I took a trip with Bishop Hope Morgan Ward and some other pastors down to the Texas-Mexico border. And this was back in early February at a time when there seemed to be a lot more talk about immigration, just in the broader culture. And the rhetoric in the air at the time, it centered around a fear of the so-called migrant caravan that was dead set on invading and infesting our country. Now, in our story today, Pharaoh, he didn't know the Hebrew people, and that unknowing led Pharaoh to fear them, to fear the Hebrew people. It led Pharaoh to paint them with a broad brush, to turn them into a sort of boogeyman, didn't it? Now, prior to my trip to the border, I had been very tuned in to the rhetoric surrounding the migrants at the border. Boogeyman language was everywhere, it seemed. Words like invasion, infestation. These words really matter. That sort of rhetoric, it gives us images of war and terrorists and disease. But on that trip, we ended up spending a morning in Matamoros, Mexico. And it's this town right across the Rio Grande River, right across from Brownsville, Texas. Matamoros was the site, and still is the site, of a massive tent city where thousands of asylum-seeking migrants are temporarily living. And we walked through that tent city that morning with a translator. He himself was a Mexican Methodist pastor. And in that experience of hearing people's stories, I had the opportunity to come face to face with the so-called threat, the violent threat that people had been talking about. The unknown boogeyman that everyone had been talking about on the other side of the border turned out to be a nursing infant, and young children drawing in the dirt with sticks turned out to be, exhausted and anxious and incredibly fearful parents. In our story today, Pharaoh didn't know the Hebrew people, and so he feared them, but Shiphrah and Puah, they did know the Hebrew women very intimately, and that made all the difference. They were able to see in these Hebrew women and children their own reflections. They were able to see in them the image of God. And in that tent city, for me, I was able to see in the face of a 5-year-old migrant girl the face of my own 5-year-old daughter. It made all the difference. And I wonder if one of the things God is calling the church to do and to be in this time and place is to be a bold witness of our shared humanity, that we are all beloved children of God, created in the image of God. And what would it look like? What would it mean if Christians all around the world, all throughout the church, were to say, my fear of God leads me to love, not fear the stranger. My fear of God leads me to love, not fear the unknown other, whoever that may be. What if Christians all throughout the world were to say, my fear of God leads me to see the stranger as my neighbor, right? To see the unknown other as my brother or sister. What if God is calling the church to be that kind of witness in this time and place? Now, the unknown comes to us often like that, as the stranger, as the unknown other, but it's also true that the unknown also comes to us as simply the uncertainty of the future. How, then, I wonder, is God calling the church to follow Shiphrah and Puah in their example of being courageous in the face of the unknown? I think today, and I give God thanks today for our weekday ministries here at St. James, the preschool program, the after-school program. The truth is, while no one really knows exactly what will unfold over the weeks ahead with our students and our schools, leaders like Dana and Daewon here at St. James have taken a very courageous step to do something. Right? Well, we may not know what will happen. They've done something. And parents during this pandemic are desperate for help. And kids are desperate for a safe and a welcoming space to be. And so St. James is trusting God to be faithful to our faithfulness. Right? We're submitting, in a way, our fears of the unknown to our fear of God. I think today also of our food ministry here at St. James. Food insecurity, certainly before the pandemic, was a big issue in our community. But the economic fallout because of the pandemic has really exacerbated all these issues around food insecurity. And while none of us could have known what the need would be and what our ability would be to meet the need, there are leaders here at St. James who have really stepped up and stepped out in faith with courage in the face of the unknown. Fear of God has given folks courage to do something. Courage in the face of the unknown. Friends, I believe today that God is calling each one of us to follow Shiphrah and Puah's example of facing the unknown with courage, of submitting our fears to our ultimate fear, of our fear of God. So friends, let your fear, whatever it may be today, let your fear of God conquer all those other fears. May it give you courage to face the unknown. Amen.